November 24, 1944. Northfield, Tinian, and Isley Field, Saipan. The 21st Bomber Command launches 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses toward the Japanese mainland. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell commands the American Strategic Bombing Force from his headquarters on Guam, dispatching Silver bombers, carrying 277 tons of bombs against the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant on Tokyo's outskirts. What Japanese fighter pilots discover this morning will shatter their understanding of aerial warfare and reveal a technological gap that no amount of courage or determination can overcome. Captain Tatsuo Yamada adjusts his oxygen mask in the cockpit of his Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien at Chofu Airfield outside Tokyo. The morning briefing emphasized intercepting enemy bombers with maximum altitude advantage. Intelligence reports indicate large four-engine bombers operating from newly captured Mariana Islands bases, flying at unprecedented heights. Yamada volunteers for the high-altitude interception mission that promises difficult combat against an enemy whose capabilities remain largely unknown. His aircraft carries four 12.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, weapons designed for combat at conventional altitudes where Japanese fighters excelled. The altitude challenge emerged from Japan's limited experience against American heavy bombers in China during early 1944. Those B-24 Liberators and older B-17 Flying Fortresses operated at altitudes Japanese fighters could reach, typically between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. But this morning's intelligence reports suggest these new bombers operate far higher than anything previously encountered. The 21st Bomber Command represents America's most powerful Pacific strategic deployment. The command would eventually total over 1,000 aircraft, operating from 5 major airfields across Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, with pressurized cabins designed specifically for extreme high-altitude operations over vast Pacific distances. This construction philosophy differed fundamentally from previous American bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator used unpressurized crew compartments that required heavy flight suits and oxygen masks, limiting their effective operational ceiling to around 25,000 feet. American designers prioritized altitude capability in the B-29, accepting complexity in exchange for operational sanctuary above enemy interceptor range. The pressurization system allowed crews to work in shirt sleeves at altitudes where unpressurized aircraft crews would struggle with cold and hypoxia. Yamada's formation includes Ki-61 Hiens from the 244th Sentai and Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki interceptors from the 47th Sentai, climbing desperately from multiple airfields around Tokyo at maximum sustainable rate. The Japanese pilots observe contrails forming at extreme altitude where American formations approach from the southeast. Radar operators at the Chiba Detection Station identify the incoming formation at 27,000 to 31,000 feet, varying their altitude as they navigate weather conditions. Ground controllers vector defending fighters toward the threat axis, but the climbing interceptors struggle to reach even 25,000 feet before the bombers arrive over target. The technological disparity becomes immediately apparent as opposing forces attempt engagement for the first time. Yamada flies an aircraft designed in 1941 for medium-altitude combat against Chinese and early Pacific War opposition. His Ki-61 weighs 7,650 pounds with a 1,175 horsepower Kawasaki Ha-40 liquid-cooled engine, providing 368 miles per hour maximum speed at 16,400 feet. While specifications claim a service ceiling of 36,000 feet. Actual combat performance degrades severely above 28,000 feet. The engine loses power dramatically in thin atmosphere, while control surfaces become increasingly sluggish. Yamada pushes his Ki 61 to absolute ceiling, the airspeed indicator showing barely 180 miles per hour as the fighter wallows in thin atmosphere, approaching 30,000 feet. The mission briefing emphasized attacking from above, using diving passes to maintain energy, but reaching position above the bombers proves impossible. The Hien sustains 30,000 feet for mere seconds before stalling, forcing recovery that costs 3,000 feet of altitude. Yamada observes bomber contrails passing overhead, their defensive guns tracking his fighter but not firing due to extreme range. The altitude gulf prevents any meaningful engagement despite desperate Japanese efforts. That morning, only 40 Japanese fighters manage any attacks on the bomber formation, most achieving just single firing passes before losing energy. The technological mismatch was complete and undeniable. The B-29 era had begun, and Japanese home defenses had no answer. By late 1944, Japan faced systematic destruction from the air, and the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The fall of Saipan, in July 1944, provided American forces with bases approximately 1,500 miles from Tokyo, placing the Japanese home islands within range of strategic bombing for the first time. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was devastating, but the material consequences would prove far worse. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the culmination of American strategic bombing doctrine development that began in the 1930s. Army Air Corps planners had long advocated for strategic bombing as a war-winning capability, arguing that attacking an enemy's industrial capacity could achieve victory without the massive ground campaigns that had characterized World War I. But realizing this vision required bombers with unprecedented range, altitude, and payload capacity. Boeing's design team began work on what would become the B-29 inches 1938, responding to an Army Air Corps requirement for a hemisphere defense bomber capable of striking targets at extreme range. The design specification called for a combat radius of over 2,000 miles, a service ceiling above 30,000 feet, a cruising speed over 250 miles per hour, and defensive armament sufficient to survive without fighter escort. Meeting these requirements demanded revolutionary technological innovations. The B-29 would be the first production aircraft with fully pressurized crew compartments. 4 Wright-R, 3,350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing over 2,000 horsepower, would drive the aircraft. Remotely controlled defensive gun turrets would provide coordinated fire through an analog computer system. The technological ambition was extraordinary, and the development costs reflected it. The B-29 program consumed approximately $3 billion, making it the most expensive weapons development project of World War II aside from the Manhattan Project. For comparison, Japan's entire military aviation budget for the entire war totaled less than this single American program. The industrial and technological disparity between the combatants was staggering and growing wider with each passing month. Japanese military aviation had developed along fundamentally different lines. Pre-war Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive operations using carrier-based aircraft and land-based medium bombers. Fighter design prioritized maneuverability and range over armor protection and firepower. The philosophy worked brilliantly during the war's early phases, when Japanese forces fought Chinese opposition and colonial powers with limited modern equipment. But by late 1944, Japanese aircraft designs from 1940 and 1941 faced American aircraft incorporating 3 additional years of combat experience and technological development. The performance gap had become a chasm. Japanese engines lacked the supercharging technology that allowed American engines to maintain power at high altitude. Japanese aircraft lacked effective pressurization, forcing pilots to operate in extreme cold with inadequate oxygen systems. Japanese industrial capacity could not produce the precision components required for advanced aviation systems. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam during the summer of 1944 provided the bases needed for B-29 operations. Army engineers and Navy Seabees constructed 5 massive airfields capable of handling the heavy bombers. Each runway was over 8,000 feet long and 200 feet wide. Built to handle aircraft weighing over 140,000 pounds fully loaded. Taxiways, hard stands, fuel storage facilities, ammunition bunkers, and maintenance hangars were constructed with unprecedented speed. By November 1944, the 21st Bomber Command, under Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, was ready to begin operations. The first mission, scheduled for November 24th, would target the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant in Tokyo. This facility produced engines for Japanese fighters, making it a high-priority target. Destroying it would directly impact Japan's ability to defend against future raids. Japanese intelligence had detected the B-29 buildup in the Marianas and correctly assessed the threat. Emergency measures were implemented to strengthen home defense. Fighter units were recalled from forward areas. Anti-aircraft batteries were reinforced around major cities and industrial centers. Early warning radar networks were expanded. But these preparations, however extensive, could not overcome fundamental technological limitations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the decisive importance of technological superiority in modern warfare. Japanese fighters would climb to intercept the raiders using every ounce of their performance capability. But the B-29 seconds would cruise serenely above them, protected by altitude sanctuary that Japanese technology could not penetrate. The bombing campaign about to begin would systematically destroy Japan's war-making capacity while demonstrating that courage and determination could not compensate for technological inferiority. The first indication that something was profoundly different about these American bombers came from radar operators at coastal early warning stations. At approximately 7:30 a.m. on November 24th, operators detected a large formation approaching from the south-southeast at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The returns were stronger than typical bomber contacts, suggesting either a very large formation or unusually large individual aircraft. As the formation closed on the Japanese coast, the altitude readings caused initial disbelief. The bombers were cruising at altitudes between 27,000 and 31,000 feet, thousands of feet higher than previous American heavy bomber raids. Controllers at the Chiba detection station immediately recognized the implications. Japanese fighters would struggle to reach these altitudes, and even if they did, their performance would be severely degraded. Emergency scramble orders went out to every fighter unit within range of Tokyo. Captain Yamada's Ki-61 was among the first to take off from Chofu Airfield. He initiated a maximum performance climb, pushing his engine to full power while maintaining the optimal climb speed of 140 miles per hour. The Kawasaki Ha-40 engine roared at maximum revolutions, consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate, but providing the power needed to claw for altitude. At 10,000 feet, Yamada could still feel his aircraft responding crisply to control inputs. The engine temperature was high, but within acceptable limits. At 15,000 feet, the performance began degrading noticeably. The rate of climb decreased from 2,000 feet per minute to 1,500. The air grew thin and cold, and despite his heavy flight suit and oxygen mask, Yamada could feel the chill penetrating. At 20,000 feet, he engaged his oxygen system fully, knowing that above this altitude, survival depended on the equipment functioning properly. At 25,000 feet, the Key 61 was approaching its practical ceiling. The rate of climb had fallen to less than 500 feet per minute. The airspeed indicator showed 180 miles per hour, barely above stalling speed. Control responses were sluggish. The engine labored, producing a fraction of its sea-level power. Yamada could see contrails above him, brilliant white lines across the blue sky, marking where the B-29 formation cruised thousands of feet higher. He pushed his fighter higher, trading speed for altitude. At 28,000 feet, the airspeed had dropped to 160 miles per hour. The aircraft felt mushy, on the verge of stalling. At 29,000 feet, the controls barely responded. The engine temperature was in the red zone. Oil pressure fluctuated dangerously. 1,000 feet, Yamada coaxed his fighter upward, knowing he was exceeding every performance limitation, risking engine failure or structural damage. At 30,000 feet, the Key 61 hung in the air for perhaps 10 seconds. Yamada could see the B-29 formation clearly now. Massive silver aircraft flying in disciplined formation, their contrails streaming behind them. He attempted to maneuver for an attack, but the controls were nearly useless. The slightest bank caused the airspeed to bleed away. Before he could line up a shot, fighter stalled. The nose dropped, and Yamada fell away, losing 3,000 feet before he could recover control. He tried again, climbing back toward the bombers, but the pattern repeated. Every attempt to reach attack position ended in a stall. Other Japanese fighters experienced the same frustration. Nakajima Ki 44 Shoki interceptors, specifically designed for high-altitude combat with superior climb rates, managed to reach 28,000 feet, but could not sustain that altitude long enough for effective attacks. The few fighters that achieved firing position discovered another problem. Machine gun rounds fired in thin air lost velocity rapidly. Ballistic trajectories were distorted. Rounds that would have been effective at 20,000 feet fell short at 30,000. The technological mismatch was complete. Meanwhile, aboard the B-29 seconds, crews worked in relative comfort. Captain Robert Morgan, commanding the lead Superfortress Dauntless Dottie, maintained formation at 29,000 feet, with his pressurized cabin at an equivalent altitude of 8,000 feet. He wore a light flight suit, not the bulky high-altitude gear required in B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds. His crew moved freely through the aircraft, checking equipment, adjusting navigation. The four Wright R-3350 engines hummed smoothly, their turbo superchargers compressing the thin atmosphere to maintain full power. True airspeed was over 300 miles per hour. The defensive gun system tracked multiple targets, though none came close enough to warrant firing. The discovery was complete. The B-29 operated in an altitude sanctuary that Japanese fighters could not reach. Captain Yamada's reaction upon returning to Chofu Airfield mixed frustration with stark realization. He had flown a perfect interception, achieved maximum altitude, positioned himself correctly, yet accomplished nothing. The mission debriefing revealed that his experience was universal among the defending fighters. Of approximately 150 Japanese fighters that scrambled to intercept the raid, fewer than 40 achieved any firing opportunity. Of those, none scored confirmed kills. Ground commanders at the 1st Air Army headquarters in Tokyo received the reports with growing alarm. Major General Toshio Miwa commanding home defense fighters, immediately recognized the implications. If Japanese fighters could not reach the bombers, they could not defend the home islands. The psychological impact on pilot morale would be devastating, and the material consequences for Japanese cities and industries would be catastrophic. Emergency conferences were convened that evening. Fighter commanders, technical officers, and intelligence specialists gathered to analyze the problem and develop countermeasures. The discussions revealed the depth of Japanese disadvantage. Technical officers explained that turbo supercharging, the technology allowing B-29 engines to maintain power at extreme altitude, was beyond current Japanese manufacturing capability. The precision machining required, the special alloys needed, the engineering knowledge necessary, all exceeded Japanese industrial capacity. Proposals emerged for modifying existing fighters to improve high-altitude performance. Stripping armor and reducing armament would decrease weight, allowing higher ceilings. Installing improved oxygen systems might help pilots function at extreme altitude. Developing new climbing tactics might position fighters more effectively. But even the officers proposing these measures recognized they were addressing symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental problem was technological inferiority that could not be quickly overcome. The reaction from Japanese political leadership was equally grim. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso had taken office in July 1944 after the fall of Saipan forced the previous government's resignation. He understood that American bombers operating with impunity over Japanese cities would undermine public morale and military-industrial capacity simultaneously. But he also understood that Japan lacked the resources to develop effective countermeasures quickly. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the raid's results, asked his military advisors pointed questions about Japan's ability to defend against future attacks. The answers were evasive, but the implications clear. If 111 bombers could reach Tokyo and return with minimal losses, future raids with larger formations would be even more devastating. The cumulative effect would be systematic destruction of Japan's war-making capacity. American reaction to the raid was more measured. The bombing results were disappointing, with only 24 bombers actually hitting the primary target and damage to the Musashino plant assessed as minimal. Mechanical problems had forced many bombers to abort or attack secondary targets, but the strategic significance was profound. The raid proved that B-29 seconds could reach Japan from the Marianas, operate at altitudes beyond effective Japanese interception, and return safely. General Hansel recognized that the bombing accuracy needed improvement. High-altitude precision bombing proved more difficult than anticipated, with winds, weather, and navigation challenges degrading results. But he also understood that the fundamental concept was sound. Future raids would benefit from experience, improved techniques, and growing force strength as more B-29 seconds arrived in the Marianas. At Army Air Forces headquarters in Washington, General Henry Arnold viewed the raid as vindication of strategic bombing doctrine and the massive investment in B-29 development. The technological advantage was clear and decisive. Japanese fighters could not effectively challenge the bombers. Anti-aircraft fire proved ineffective. Weather and navigation were challenges to be overcome through experience and training. Reactions on both sides thus reflected fundamentally different strategic situations. Japan faced systematic aerial destruction with no effective countermeasures, leading to desperation and declining morale. America faced technical challenges in achieving optimal bombing results, but operated from a position of overwhelming technological superiority that would only increase with time and experience. The divergence in reactions illustrated the broader trajectory of the Pacific War by late 1944. Japan fought desperately to delay inevitable defeat, seeking miracles or decisive battles that might change the trajectory. America methodically applied superior resources and technology to achieve victory systematically. The B-29 raids represented this dynamic in microcosm. Japanese courage and determination confronting American technological and industrial might, with the outcome increasingly certain. The fundamental contradiction facing Japanese fighter defense centered on aircraft designed for entirely different operational requirements, now being asked to perform missions beyond their capabilities. The Ki-61 Hien and Ki-44 Shoki represented sophisticated designs optimized for medium-altitude combat, where maneuverability, armament, and pilot skill determined outcomes, but high-altitude interception required completely different design philosophies that Japanese engineers understood theoretically but could not implement practically. Japanese fighter design emphasized low wing loading for superior maneuverability. This philosophy worked brilliantly at altitudes below 20,000 feet, where Japanese fighters could outturn and outmaneuver heavier American fighters. The famous Zero fighter had dominated early Pacific air combat through extreme maneuverability achieved by minimizing weight. But low wing loading meant lower maximum speed and degraded performance at high altitude, where thin air provided insufficient lift for aggressive maneuvering. American fighter design, by contrast, accepted higher wing loading in exchange for speed and altitude performance. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang could not match Japanese fighters in turning combat at medium altitude, but they dominated at high altitude, where their turbo-supercharged engines maintained power and their higher wing loading provided better high-speed handling. The contradiction was that Japanese doctrine emphasized exactly the combat characteristics least relevant to B-29 interception. Engine technology presented another contradiction. Japanese aviation engines, like the Kawasaki Ha-40 and Nakajima Ha-109, were sophisticated designs that performed well at their design altitudes. But they lacked the turbo supercharging or mechanical supercharging necessary to maintain power in thin atmosphere above 25,000 feet. American engines, like the Wright R-3350, used two-stage turbo superchargers that compressed thin, high-altitude air, maintaining sea-level power up to 25,000 feet, and substantial power beyond 30,000 feet. The contradiction was not that Japanese engineers were ignorant of supercharging technology. They understood the principles and had attempted to develop similar systems. But superchargers required precision manufacturing tolerances, special high-temperature alloys, and sophisticated control systems that exceeded Japanese industrial capability. Japan could design advanced engines on paper, but could not manufacture them in quantity with sufficient reliability. Armament presented yet another contradiction. Japanese fighters carried weapons optimized for destroying lightly armored aircraft at close range. Machine guns and small-caliber cannons were effective against unarmored or lightly armored targets, but lacked the hitting power to quickly destroy heavily armored bombers. American fighters evolved toward heavier armament specifically for bomber destruction, with 50-caliber machine guns and later 20mm cannons providing devastating firepower. But even when Japanese fighters mounted adequate armament, the high-altitude engagement problem rendered weapons ineffective. Ballistics at 30,000 feet differed drastically from sea-level performance. Reduced air density affected projectile trajectory. Reduced engine power limited attack profiles. The few Japanese fighters reaching firing position lacked the energy for sustained attacks, managing only brief snapshots before stalling away. The oxygen system contradiction was particularly acute. Japanese fighters carried oxygen equipment designed for short-duration interceptions at moderate altitudes. The systems provided adequate oxygen for climbs to 25,000 feet and brief combat at that altitude, but sustained operations above 28,000 feet exceeded system capacity. Pilots suffered hypoxia even while using oxygen because the systems could not deliver sufficient volume at extreme altitude. American bomber crews, by contrast, worked in pressurized cabins equivalent to 8,000 feet altitude. They breathed normally, without oxygen masks, worked comfortably in shirt sleeves, and suffered none of the physiological impairment affecting Japanese pilots. This fundamental design difference meant American crews could function effectively for hours at altitudes where Japanese pilots could barely survive for minutes. The training contradiction compounded all technical limitations. Japanese pilot training by late 1944 emphasized rapid production of barely adequate pilots to replace catastrophic losses. Pre-war training programs that produced superbly skilled pilots had been abandoned due to time and fuel constraints. New pilots received abbreviated instruction, focusing on basic flight skills and simple combat tactics. High-altitude interception techniques, already inadequately developed, were barely taught. American pilot training, conversely, had become an industrial process, producing thousands of well-trained pilots annually. Training programs incorporated combat experience systematically, updating curriculum based on operational lessons. Pilots practiced high-altitude operations extensively and understood physiological effects and equipment limitations thoroughly. The contradiction was that as Japanese pilot quality declined, American pilot quality increased, widening the capability gap. The ultimate contradiction was strategic. Japan needed effective high-altitude fighters desperately, but lacked the industrial capacity, technological base, and time to develop them. America possessed overwhelming capability to produce advanced aircraft, but faced no comparable threat requiring similar development. The asymmetry was complete and decisive. The post-mission investigation conducted by Japanese military intelligence and technical officers revealed the comprehensive nature of the defeat suffered on November 24th. Analysis teams collected reports from pilots, radar operators, anti-aircraft batteries, and civilian observers. The data painted a devastating picture of Japanese defensive inadequacy against high-altitude strategic bombing. Of 111 B-29 seconds launched from the Marianas, approximately 90 reached Tokyo. Mechanical problems forced several to turn back, and weather scattered the formation somewhat, but the majority proceeded to target. Japanese early warning systems detected the raid with adequate time for fighter interception. Yet defensive efforts proved almost completely ineffective. Only one B-29 was lost to enemy action, possibly from anti-aircraft fire rather than fighter attack, representing less than 1% loss rate. Japanese fighters flew approximately 150 sorties, attempting to intercept the raid. Pilots reported achieving firing position on only about 40 occasions. Of these attacks, most consisted of single brief firing passes before the attacker stalled or lost position. Ammunition expenditure was estimated at over 12,000 rounds of machine gun and cannon fire. The result was one probable kill, several possible hits with unconfirmed damage, and otherwise no effect on the bomber formation. Anti-aircraft batteries fired over 5,000 shells at the raiding force. Post-battle analysis indicated that most shells burst thousands of feet below the bombers, despite maximum elevation settings. The few shells reaching bomber altitude detonated too far from targets to cause damage. The combination of extreme altitude, high target speed, and limited fire control technology rendered anti-aircraft fire largely ineffective. The consequence for the Nakajima Musashino plant was fortunately minimal from the Japanese perspective. Only 24 B-29 seconds actually hit the primary target, with bombs scattered across the facility causing moderate damage. Production disruption was limited, and repairs could be completed within weeks. But Japanese planners recognized that this fortunate outcome resulted from American bombing inaccuracy rather than effective defense. Future raids with improved accuracy would be far more destructive. The broader consequence was psychological. Japanese military leaders understood that if American bombers could attack with near impunity, systematic destruction of industrial capacity was inevitable. Home island's air defense, considered a final guarantee of national survival, had proven inadequate. The implications for continuing the war were stark and unavoidable. Technical investigation focused on understanding B-29 capabilities and developing countermeasures. Intelligence officers interrogated witnesses who observed the bombers. Pilots who achieved close approaches provided descriptions of aircraft features. Technical specialists analyzed the data, attempting to understand how American aircraft achieved such performance advantages. The investigation confirmed that B-29 seconds operated with pressurized cabins, explaining crew effectiveness at extreme altitude. Turbo-supercharged engines maintained power beyond Japanese fighter capabilities. Remote-controlled gun turrets provided coordinated defensive fire. Navigation and bombing equipment exceeded Japanese understanding. Every aspect of the bomber represented technological advancement beyond Japanese capability to replicate quickly. Proposed countermeasures ranged from practical to desperate. Fighter modifications to improve high-altitude performance were ordered immediately. Stripping armor and reducing armament decreased weight. Installing water methanol injection systems boosted engine power temporarily. Improved oxygen systems were developed. Special climbing tactics were practiced. But technical officers privately acknowledged these measures provided only marginal improvements against an overwhelming disadvantage. More desperate proposals included ramming attacks, where fighters would deliberately collide with bombers, sacrificing themselves to destroy targets they could not shoot down conventionally. This suicide tactic, horrifying from Western perspective, was discussed seriously as potentially the only effective means of stopping high-altitude raids. The fact that such measures were contemplated revealed the desperation pervading Japanese air defense planning. The long-term consequence was acceleration of Japanese industrial and military decline. Each successful B-29 raid would inflict cumulative damage to war production capacity. Aircraft engine production, already inadequate, would suffer from attacks like the Musashino raid. Ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, steel mills, and other critical facilities would be systematically destroyed. The investigation's ultimate conclusion was that Japan lacked effective means to prevent this systematic destruction. For American planners, the investigation of raid results was more optimistic despite disappointing bombing accuracy. The fundamental concept was validated. B-29 seconds could reach Japan, survive enemy defenses, and return to base with acceptable losses. Improving bombing accuracy was a technical challenge to be solved through training, experience, and equipment refinement. But the strategic framework worked. Future raids would become larger, more accurate, and more destructive as the bomber force grew and operational experience accumulated. Japanese defense planners developed multiple theories for countering B-29 raids, each reflecting different assumptions about achievable solutions. The debates among air defense commanders, technical specialists, and operational pilots revealed both creative, tactical thinking and desperate recognition of fundamental limitations. No single approach promised effectiveness, but combination tactics might at least increase losses sufficiently to deter American operations. The altitude superiority theory proposed developing fighters capable of reaching and sustaining combat at 35,000 feet, providing altitude advantage over B-29 formations. Proponents argued that attacking from above would allow diving attacks, maintaining energy throughout engagement. Technical officers designed modified fighters with reduced weight, boosted engines, and improved oxygen systems. Prototypes achieved marginally better altitude performance, but production challenges and time constraints prevented widespread deployment. The mass attack theory emphasized overwhelming bomber formations with large numbers of fighters attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. If individual attacks were ineffective, perhaps 50 or 100 fighters attacking together could saturate defensive fire and achieve kills through sheer numbers. Pilots trained in coordinated attack patterns, but implementing this theory required concentrating fighters from multiple bases, complex timing, and fuel reserves Japan increasingly lacked. The night interception theory proposed exploiting darkness to negate B-29 altitude advantages. Japanese pilots had developed effective night fighting techniques against earlier raids. If B-29 seconds could be forced to operate at night, Japanese fighters might achieve surprise attacks before defensive gunners could respond. This theory influenced American tactics when General Curtis LeMay later shifted to low-altitude night incendiary raids, ironically making B-29 seconds more vulnerable but also more destructive. The ramming attack theory represented desperation, disguised as tactical innovation. Pilots would deliberately collide with B-29 seconds after exhausting ammunition or when unable to achieve firing position. The attacks were framed as heroic sacrifice rather than suicide, though the distinction was largely semantic. Some pilots volunteered for ramming missions, believing their deaths could save cities below. The theory achieved limited implementation, but demonstrated the psychological extremity of Japanese defensive efforts. American strategic theory evolved based on operational experience. Initial doctrine emphasized high-altitude precision bombing against specific industrial targets. General Hansel believed destroying key facilities like aircraft engine plants would cripple Japanese war production systematically. This theory required accurate bombing from extreme altitude, which proved more difficult than anticipated. Weather, winds, and navigation challenges degraded accuracy significantly. The area bombing theory, advocated by General Curtis LeMay, who replaced Hansel in January 1945, proposed massive incendiary attacks against urban areas rather than precision strikes against specific facilities. Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, were extremely vulnerable to fire. Incendiary raids could destroy entire urban districts, obliterating dispersed war industries and demoralizing civilian populations. This theory proved devastatingly effective, but morally controversial. The strategic attrition theory underlying all-American planning emphasized systematically destroying Japan's capacity to continue fighting. Whether through precision strikes or area bombing, the goal was cumulative damage exceeding Japan's ability to repair or replace. Industrial capacity would decline. Transportation networks would be disrupted. Urban populations would be displaced. Eventually, continuing the war would become impossible, regardless of military determination. Japanese counter-theory emphasized endurance and willingness to absorb punishment. If American bombing could be made costly enough, perhaps political will to continue the war would weaken. This theory fundamentally misunderstood American strategic thinking, which accepted casualties as necessary costs toward inevitable victory. The massive industrial capacity supporting B-29 operations could sustain losses indefinitely, while Japanese capacity declined. The technological advantage theory, increasingly dominant in American planning, held that superior technology would prove decisive regardless of tactics. B-29 seconds represented such overwhelming technological advancement that even imperfect employment achieved strategic effects. As technology improved and operational experience accumulated, effectiveness would increase systematically. This theory proved correct, with later raids achieving far greater destruction than early attempts. Japanese leadership gradually recognized that no theory offered realistic hope of stopping the bombing campaign. Each defensive approach was tried and found wanting. Technical limitations could not be overcome quickly. Industrial capacity could not produce sufficient fighters or improve designs. The cumulative realization influenced Emperor Hirohito's eventual decision to accept surrender terms rather than continue futile resistance. The ultimate vindication came when B-29 seconds delivered atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The aircraft that Japanese fighters could not reach at 30,000 feet dropped weapons that instantly destroyed entire cities. The technological advantage was not merely substantial, but decisive and absolute. Strategic bombing theory, controversial before the war, was validated through overwhelming demonstration of capability. The deeper mystery surrounding Japanese inability to counter B-29 raids extends beyond simple technological comparison to fundamental questions about industrial capacity, scientific development, and strategic decision-making. Why could Japan not develop effective high-altitude fighters when the requirement was clear and urgent? The answer reveals the accumulated consequences of decisions made years earlier and structural limitations impossible to overcome quickly. Japanese aviation industry, in 1944, operated at the limits of its capacity. Factories produced fighters at maximum sustainable rates, but could not increase output significantly without workers, materials, and machine tools unavailable. American strategic bombing of industrial facilities further reduced capacity. Raw material shortages, especially critical metals and aviation-grade aluminum, constrained production. The industrial base simply lacked the slack necessary to surge production or retool for new designs. The technical knowledge gap was equally significant. Japanese engineers understood turbo-supercharging principles theoretically, but lacked practical experience manufacturing such systems. American engineers had spent years developing turbo-superchargers, solving thousands of technical problems through iterative testing and refinement. Japanese attempts to replicate the technology faced all those problems simultaneously without the time, resources, or experience base to solve them systematically. Material science limitations prevented replicating American capabilities even when designs were understood. Turbo superchargers required special heat-resistant alloys that could withstand exhaust gas temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Japanese metallurgy could not produce these alloys in quantity with necessary quality. Precision bearings needed for turbo superchargers exceeded Japanese manufacturing tolerances. Each component posed problems that required years to solve properly. The turning point in Japanese defensive efforts came not from any single failed defense, but from the cumulative realization that technological inferiority extended across all military capabilities. If Japanese fighters could not reach American bombers, if Japanese radar was less capable, if Japanese anti-aircraft guns were less accurate, if Japanese industrial capacity could not match American production, then the war was lost, regardless of fighting spirit or tactical innovations. This realization emerged gradually through early 1945 as B-29 raids increased in size and frequency. December 1944 saw multiple raids. January 1945 brought more. February's raids included devastating firebombing of Tokyo, killing over 80,000 civilians. Each raid demonstrated Japanese helplessness. Fighter losses mounted without corresponding bomber losses. Pilots became demoralized. The turning point was psychological as much as material. Emperor Hirohito's thinking evolved during this period based on briefings about air defense inadequacy. Traditional military advisors counseled continued resistance, arguing that American will might weaken if casualties increased. But Hirohito recognized that Japan was being systematically destroyed from the air without effective countermeasures. The imperial palace itself burned during Tokyo raids, bringing the war's reality directly to the emperor's experience. The mystery of why effective countermeasures were never developed has multiple answers. Time was insufficient for developing new aircraft designs. Resources were inadequate for producing advanced systems. Industrial capacity could not support major rearmament programs. Scientific base was too narrow for rapid innovation. Training infrastructure could not produce sufficient, skilled pilots. Each limitation reinforced others, creating compound disadvantage impossible to overcome. The strategic turning point came when Japanese leadership accepted that continuing the war meant national suicide. B-29 raids were destroying cities systematically. Blockade was starving the nation. Industrial capacity was collapsing. The alternatives were surrender or annihilation. Emperor Hirohito's decision to accept unconditional surrender after atomic bombings reflected recognition that further resistance was futile genocide rather than honorable combat. The atomic bombings themselves revealed the ultimate consequence of altitude sanctuary. B-29 seconds, carrying weapons of unprecedented power, approached targets at altitudes beyond interception. Japanese defenders tracked the aircraft on radar, scrambled fighters, fired anti-aircraft guns, and accomplished nothing. The bombers released their weapons and escaped. The mystery was not how the atomic bombs worked, but how to stop aircraft delivering them. The answer was that Japan could not stop them with available technology. Post-war analysis by American and Japanese investigators confirmed that no realistic countermeasures could have been developed quickly enough to matter. Even if Japan had started developing advanced fighters in 1943, they would not have entered service in quantity until 1946 at earliest. By then, the war would be long over. The turning point had come and passed before Japanese leadership fully recognized it. The deeper mystery ultimately reveals the decisive importance of industrial capacity and technological development in modern total war. Individual courage, tactical skill, and strategic insight matter, but they cannot overcome fundamental disadvantages in industrial production and technological capability. Japan's brave pilots, flying obsolete aircraft against opponents possessing overwhelming technological superiority, could achieve nothing except noble deaths. The mystery was not why Japan lost, but why Japanese leadership did not recognize inevitable defeat sooner and spare their nation further destruction. The strategic implications of B-29 operations over Japan extended far beyond immediate tactical results to reshape understanding of air power's role in modern warfare. The campaign vindicated pre-war strategic bombing theories that had been controversial and unproven. It demonstrated that air power, properly employed with adequate technology, could achieve decisive strategic effects without requiring massive ground campaigns. The implications influenced military planning for decades. The immediate tactical implication was that altitude sanctuary provided by advanced technology created safe operating environments for strategic bombing. Japanese fighters could not effectively intercept B-29 seconds at operational altitude. Anti-aircraft fire proved largely ineffective. Weather posed more danger than enemy defenses. This tactical reality enabled systematic destruction of Japanese industrial capacity with acceptable loss rates, usually below 5% per mission and often below 2%. The strategic bombing doctrine implication was profound. Pre-war air power theorists like Giulio Douhet, Hugh Trenchard, and Billy Mitchell had argued that strategic bombing could win wars independently of ground forces. Their theories were controversial and largely untested. The B-29 campaign over Japan provided convincing demonstration. Japanese industrial capacity was systematically destroyed. Transportation networks were disrupted. Urban areas were devastated. The atomic weapon delivery implication was perhaps most significant for post-war planning. The B-29 seconds that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki operated at altitudes beyond Japanese interception capability. Even if Japanese defenders had known atomic weapons were aboard, they could not have stopped the attacks with available technology. This demonstrated that nuclear weapons could be delivered reliably by high-altitude bombers, establishing the foundation for strategic deterrence doctrine throughout the Cold War. The industrial capacity implication revealed the decisive importance of manufacturing capability in modern total war. American industry produced nearly 4,000 B-29 seconds during World War II, while simultaneously building tens of thousands of other aircraft. Japanese industry could not produce comparable quantities of inferior fighters. The asymmetry was overwhelming. Wars between industrial powers would be won by the side with greater production capacity, superior technology, and ability to sustain operations despite losses. The technological development implication influenced military planning globally. Nations recognized that technological superiority could provide decisive advantages regardless of troop numbers or tactical skills. Post-war military budgets emphasized research and development. Technological competition became central to Cold War strategy. The B-29 campaign demonstrated that investing in advanced weapon systems paid strategic dividends far exceeding their costs. The air defense implication drove post-war fighter development worldwide. Nations recognized that defending against high-altitude strategic bombers required specialized interceptors with capabilities far exceeding typical fighter aircraft. Jet engines, radar-guided missiles, sophisticated fire control systems, and other advanced technologies became priorities. The arms race between bombers and interceptors dominated military aviation development through the 1950s and 60s. The psychological warfare implication was equally significant. B-29 raids demoralized Japanese civilian populations while demonstrating American technological superiority. The inability to defend against attacks undermined confidence in military leadership and civilian willingness to continue fighting. Psychological effects complemented physical destruction, accelerating the decision to surrender. Future strategic bombing doctrine incorporated psychological objectives explicitly. The humanitarian implication raised enduring moral questions. Strategic bombing killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, with firebombing raids on Tokyo, Osaka, and other cities causing casualties exceeding even atomic bombings. The moral debate about deliberately targeting civilian populations continues. Supporters argue that strategic bombing shortened the war and saved lives by preventing invasion. Critics contend that killing civilians was morally indefensible, regardless of strategic justification. The deterrence implication shaped Cold War strategy fundamentally. American ability to conduct strategic bombing with nuclear weapons created deterrent effect, preventing Soviet aggression. The threat of overwhelming aerial destruction influenced Soviet behavior throughout the Cold War. B-29 operational experience provided foundation for strategic air command doctrine, emphasizing bomber-delivered nuclear weapons as primary deterrent. The lesson for Japan, was bitter but clear. Technological inferiority proved decisive and insurmountable. Superior courage, tactical skill, and determination could not compensate for fundamental disadvantages in industrial capacity and technological development. The implications influenced post-war Japanese policy, emphasizing economic development over military power, focusing national resources on industrial reconstruction rather than rearmament. The ultimate implication was that modern warfare had become fundamentally industrial and technological rather than primarily martial. Victory belonged to nations with superior factories, better engineers, and more advanced technology rather than merely braver soldiers or more skilled generals. The B-29 campaign over Japan demonstrated this reality conclusively, establishing precedents that shaped military thinking for generations. Strategic bombing had proven decisive, technology had proven determinative, and industrial capacity had proven fundamental to victory in total war between advanced nations. The human dimension of B-29 operations reveals profound contrasts between American crews working in relative comfort and Japanese defenders fighting desperately against impossible odds. Both sides showed courage, but their experiences differed fundamentally in ways that reflected broader technological and industrial disparities. Understanding the human reality illuminates how war affects those who fight it and challenges simplistic narratives about heroism and sacrifice. Japanese fighter pilots experienced combat at the limits of human endurance, climbing to intercept B-29 formations at 30,000 feet, required flying at maximum performance for 30 to 45 minutes. Oxygen systems designed for shorter operations at lower altitudes proved inadequate. Pilots suffered hypoxia symptoms even while using oxygen. Confusion, impaired judgment, slowed reactions, tunnel vision. The extreme cold, -40 to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, penetrated heavy flight suits. Hands and feet went numb despite insulated gloves and boots. Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka, flying Ki-61 fighters from Chofu Airfield, described the physical ordeal in post-war interviews. Each mission demanded maximum physical effort, fighting altitude effects. Breathing became difficult even with oxygen. Hands went numb from cold. Eyes watered continuously from dry air and cold. Then watching bombers proceed unopposed while our cities burned created psychological trauma beyond combat stress. We felt we had failed our ancestors, our emperor, our people. Not through lack of effort, but through technological inability. The psychological damage exceeded physical suffering. Japanese military culture emphasized victory through superior spirit and determination. But experience against B-29 seconds contradicted this fundamental belief. No amount of courage allowed fighters to reach bombers operating thousands of feet higher. No amount of skill compensated for engines that could not produce sufficient power at altitude. The cognitive dissonance was devastating. American B-29 crews experienced war differently. Captain James Edmondson, navigator aboard a B-29 flying missions from Hien, described operations in stark contrast to Japanese experience. We wore light flight suits, not heavy altitude gear. The cabin was pressurized to 8,000 feet equivalent. We moved freely through the aircraft. The physical environment was demanding, but manageable. We knew we held every advantage. Our survival depended on equipment functioning properly and avoiding fighters. But the fighters rarely reached us. The psychological burden for American crews came from different sources. They dropped bombs, knowing they were killing civilians. Incendiary raids on Tokyo and other cities created firestorms visible from miles away, killing tens of thousands. Crew members struggled with moral implications of deliberately targeting urban areas. Some developed guilt and psychological trauma from participating in mass killing. Others rationalized actions as necessary to end the war and save American lives that would be lost in invasion. The contrast in survival rates reflected technological disparity. B-29 crews faced approximately 5% loss rate per mission, meaning statistical probability of surviving 35 mission tours was roughly 1 in 5. Dangerous, but crews believed their training, equipment, and tactics provided reasonable chance of survival. Japanese fighter pilots faced escalating loss rates as the war progressed. By early 1945, pilot life expectancy measured in weeks. Many died on their first or second mission. The humanity on both sides deserves recognition without equating experiences. Japanese pilots showed extraordinary courage attacking enemies they could not reach, knowing each mission might be their last. American crews showed courage flying long missions over enemy territory, knowing mechanical failure or lucky fighter attack could kill them. But the asymmetry was profound. Japanese fought hopeless battle against overwhelming technological superiority. Americans fought with confidence that superior equipment and training provided substantial advantages. The human cost was measured differently by each side. Japan lost thousands of pilots and crew members defending their homeland unsuccessfully. America lost hundreds of aircraft and crew members while systematically destroying Japanese war-making capacity. Both sides mourned their dead. But American losses were acceptable costs toward inevitable victory, while Japanese losses were futile sacrifices that accomplished nothing strategic. Personal stories illuminate broader patterns. Tatsuo Yamada survived the war, having flown dozens of interception missions against B-29 seconds without achieving a single confirmed kill. He carried survivor's guilt for decades, questioning why he survived when so many comrades died. Robert Morgan completed his B-29 tour and returned home, later reflecting on moral ambiguity of strategic bombing. Both men showed courage, but their wars were fundamentally different experiences, reflecting technological and industrial disparities determining outcomes. The humanity of B-29 operations reminds us that wars are fought by individuals with hopes, fears, and moral complexity. The technological and industrial factors determining victory do not diminish courage shown by those who fought, but they do reveal that in modern total war, individual bravery cannot overcome systematic disadvantages. Japanese pilots were not defeated by American pilots, but by American engineers and factory workers who created overwhelming technological advantages. Understanding this reality honors those who fought while acknowledging war's true nature. The revelation emerging from B-29 operations over Japan transcends immediate, tactical, and strategic lessons to reveal fundamental truths about modern warfare, industrial capacity, and technological development. What initially appeared as story of brave pilots and advanced bombers revealed itself as comprehensive demonstration that wars between industrial nations are won in factories and laboratories as much as on battlefields. The first revelation concerned the decisive nature of technological advantage. Japanese pilots showed extraordinary courage, tactical skill, and determination. Yet, they accomplished almost nothing against B-29 formations because technological disadvantages were insurmountable. Courage could not compensate for engines lacking turbo superchargers. Skill could not overcome oxygen systems inadequate for sustained high-altitude operations. Determination could not make control surfaces responsive in thin atmosphere. Technology determined outcomes more than traditional military virtues. The second revelation involved industrial capacity's fundamental importance. American industry produced nearly 4,000 B-29 seconds, while simultaneously building tens of thousands of other aircraft, millions of other weapons, and supporting armies fighting on multiple continents. Japanese industry struggled to produce hundreds of inferior fighters while facing resource shortages, strategic bombing damage, and infrastructure collapse. The industrial asymmetry was overwhelming and decisive. The third revelation concerned systematic development's advantages over improvisation. B-29 development began in 1938, years before war started. American engineers solved thousands of technical problems systematically through iterative testing and refinement. The aircraft entering service in 1944 incorporated lessons from years of development. Japanese attempts to quickly develop competitive aircraft faced all those problems simultaneously, without time or resources to solve them properly. The fourth revelation was about training and human capital development. American pilot training had become industrial process, producing thousands of well-trained crews annually. Training programs incorporated combat experience systematically, ensuring continuous improvement. Japanese training by late 1944 produced barely adequate pilots through abbreviated programs that could not replace losses or provide advanced skills needed for challenging missions like high-altitude interception. The fifth revelation concerned integration of multiple technological advantages. B-29 seconds did not rely on single superior characteristic, but combined many advantages: pressurization, turbo supercharging, remote-controlled guns, advanced navigation equipment, sophisticated bomb sights, reliable communication systems. Each advantage reinforced others, creating compound superiority. Japanese fighters lacked equivalent integration, with shortcomings in multiple areas compounding disadvantages. The sixth revelation involved the role of scientific and engineering infrastructure. American aviation industry could draw on vast scientific base, including universities, research laboratories, and corporate research departments. Problems encountered during development could be referred to specialists with relevant expertise. Japanese aviation industry had smaller scientific base, fewer specialists, and less institutional knowledge. This infrastructure gap proved as important as immediate material shortages. The seventh revelation was strategic, that modern total war between industrial nations is fundamentally war of industrial and technological attrition. Side with greater industrial capacity, superior technology, and ability to sustain operations despite losses will eventually prevail. Individual battles matter less than cumulative effect of systematic application of superior resources over time. Japanese military culture emphasized decisive battles where superior spirit would prevail. American strategy emphasized sustained attrition, exploiting industrial advantages. The eighth revelation concerned limits of human performance. Japanese pilots flying at extreme altitude without adequate equipment pushed human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Many suffered permanent health damage from repeated exposure to extreme cold, inadequate oxygen, and physical stress. The revelation was that equipment designed without adequate consideration of human factors degrades performance, regardless of operator skill or determination. The ninth revelation involved organizational culture's impact on innovation. American military culture encouraged questioning established doctrine and developing new approaches based on experience. B-29 tactics evolved continuously as crews developed better methods. Japanese military culture emphasized following established doctrine and respecting hierarchy. Innovation was discouraged. This cultural difference affected adaptation rates, with American forces learning faster from experience. The 10th revelation was moral ambiguity of technological advantage. B-29 seconds enabled systematic destruction of Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Technological superiority facilitated actions with profound moral implications. The revelation was that possessing overwhelming advantage creates moral responsibilities and dilemmas that cannot be avoided through appeals to military necessity. Decisions to conduct strategic bombing, especially incendiary attacks deliberately targeting civilian areas, remain morally controversial. The final revelation was about war's changing nature. World War II demonstrated that industrial and technological competition had become as important as traditional military competition. Future conflicts between advanced nations would be decided by factories, laboratories, and industrial capacity as much as by battlefield performance. The B-29 campaign over Japan provided definitive proof of this transformation, establishing precedents that shaped military thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. Modern warfare belonged to industrial powers with technological superiority, comprehensive scientific base, and systematic development processes. The legacy of B-29 operations over Japan extends through 8 decades to shape modern understanding of strategic air power, technological development, and industrial warfare. The campaign that began with the raid on November 24, 1944, demonstrated principles that remain relevant as nations continue competing for technological and industrial advantages in military capabilities. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded 21st Bomber Command during the most destructive phase of the campaign, later reflected that the B-29 proved strategic bombing could win wars independently of ground forces. The aircraft's technological advantages enabled systematic destruction of enemy war-making capacity while maintaining acceptable loss rates. This vindication of pre-war air power theory influenced post-war military organization, with independent air forces established in multiple nations based partly on B-29 campaign success. For Japanese survivors, the B-29 campaign represented national trauma that influenced post-war development fundamentally. The inability to defend against strategic bombing demonstrated technological and industrial inadequacies that national policy would address through economic reconstruction and industrial modernization. Post-war Japan emphasized civilian industry over military power, focusing resources on becoming global leader in manufacturing and technology rather than rebuilding military capacity. The atomic bombings delivered by B-29 seconds against Hiroshima and Nagasaki established precedents for nuclear weapons employment that shaped Cold War strategy. The aircraft that Japanese fighters could not reach at 30,000 feet dropped weapons instantly, destroying entire cities. This demonstration of nuclear weapon delivery capability established foundation for strategic deterrence doctrine. Throughout the Cold War, bomber-delivered nuclear weapons remained central to American and Soviet military planning. Technological innovations developed for the B-29 influenced commercial aviation development extensively. Pressurization became standard for all large aircraft. Directly adapted from military technology, the transition from military innovation to commercial application accelerated post-war economic growth and transformed global transportation. Passengers flying today in pressurized aircraft traveling at high altitude benefit from technologies pioneered for strategic bombing. The human cost of the campaign remains staggering and controversial. Strategic bombing killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 to 10, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 people in single night. More than either atomic bombing. Whether this destruction was militarily necessary or morally justified remains debated. Supporters argue it shortened the war and prevented casualties from invasion. Critics contend that deliberately targeting civilians was indefensible regardless of strategic goals. For American veterans, The B-29 campaign represented successful application of American industrial might and technological superiority to achieve strategic objectives. Crews took pride in their service while acknowledging moral complexity of their missions. Reunions of B-29 veterans continued for decades, with survivors sharing memories of challenging missions, technological marvels they flew, and mixed feelings about destruction they inflicted. Japanese pilots, who survived the war, carried different memories. They remembered desperate climbs toward enemies they could not reach, watching cities burn while unable to intervene, feeling technological inadequacy despite maximum effort. Some carried guilt about perceived failure. Others recognized they fought impossible battle against overwhelming disadvantages. All understood that courage alone could not overcome technological and industrial superiority. The broader lesson transcends specific historical details to reveal enduring truths about modern warfare. Technology matters decisively. Industrial capacity determines outcomes in wars between advanced nations. Scientific and engineering infrastructure provides foundation for military capability. Training and human capital development equal importance with equipment quality. Systematic long-term development produces better results than improvised short-term solutions. Modern military planners study the B-29 campaign for insights applicable to contemporary challenges. The principles demonstrated remain relevant. Technological advantage provides decisive benefits. Industrial capacity enables sustained operations. Integration of multiple capabilities creates compound advantages. Training and doctrine matter as much as equipment. Nations competing for military superiority continue investing heavily in technology development, industrial capacity, and systematic approaches to capability development. The story of Japanese pilots shocked by B-29 raids ultimately illustrates the decisive importance of technological and industrial factors in determining military outcomes. Brave pilots flying obsolete aircraft against technologically superior opponents could achieve nothing except honorable deaths. Their sacrifice deserves respect. But their defeat was an inevitable consequence of technological and industrial disparities beyond their control. The B-29 Superfortress proved that in modern warfare, victory belongs to nations with superior technology, greater industrial capacity, and more comprehensive development processes. The campaign over Japan demonstrated this truth decisively, establishing precedents that shaped military thinking for generations. The shock Japanese pilots experienced when encountering B-29 seconds reflected broader recognition that technological advantage had become determinative in modern combat. That lesson, learned at terrible cost by both sides, remains relevant as nations continue competing for technological superiority in an ever-changing military landscape.